Today we're going to be covering everything related to the Shroud of Turin, and I'm very, very excited about this one. Obviously, when I say we're going to be covering everything, I cannot possibly mean everything literally, because there are books and journal entries and peer-reviewed papers and scholarly articles and scientific studies all done on this one relic. So today we're going to be just going through kind of a crash course on what the Shroud is and some of the controversy and claims behind it, some of the evidence to sift through, and we're going to be drawing some theological conclusions at the end. And it's a delicate topic because people are very, very intently set on how they view what this thing is. And so I'm also going to be trying to handle this in like a sensitive way and not ruffle any feathers, but also being honest about how I think and what I believe the evidence leads to. So if I don't agree with you, I'm sorry about that in advance, but that's just kind of the nature of this. It is controversial, but I'm going to be trying to handle it in a sensitive and respectful way towards whatever you think about it. Now, the study of relics in general, to me, is so fascinating because it's kind of got a hand in so many different areas. Relics are objects, essentially, that are either parts of, meaning like body parts, or belonging to, meaning like clothing or a personal possession, or related to or coming in contact with dead saints. And I say saints because I almost want to say that with like air quotes around it, because I believe saints are those who have God's Spirit and are led by Him and belong to Him. That's who I think the saints are. And so it's not, what the Catholics or Orthodox faiths believe, where it's like the church will kind of declare people to be saints after enough time and looking back at their actions or, parts they played in church history or something. I don't see those as like the saints. But that is kind of what they're known as in this whole conversation of relics. So if I say saints, don't think that it means I'm Catholic if I'm talking about something you're like, well, that's not really a saint in my mind. Well, I might not think so either, but that's just kind of the vernacular that's used. But they are objects or body parts or things that relate to these dead saints. And a lot of times they are biblical figures. And we have all kinds of them. And they've passed through history. And they have this kind of mystic aura around them. Like some of them have belonged to kings. And some of them have been traded to different popes and priests, and some of them have been gifted, and some of them have been forged, and some of them have been sold or lost and refound. Some have legends surrounding them. Some have been broken into pieces and scattered throughout different churches or throughout different countries. They just relate to so many different things, especially in history, that I find fascinating. If you're not a history person, hopefully as we go through this crash course on the Shroud of Turin, I'm able to deliver it in kind of an effective way, kind of an efficient way. So we're not getting too bogged down, but we can kind of still go through the stuff that, I nerd out on a little bit. Because the study of relics, to me, is almost like what people, like I feel about it, what some people feel about like the Da Vinci Code or National Treasure. Like you're just kind of piecing this amazing, intricate puzzle together, and you have to kind of discern and sift through all this information. And we're looking at art, and we're looking at different depictions of things. We're also looking at different texts and historical accounts. We're also reading fables and figuring out what is myth and what is history, what's been fabricated versus what's been preserved. And all of this goes into the study of relics in general. And I cannot help but be suckered into it every single time. I've read a lot of books on this topic, and every single book I read, I'm like, man, this is just a gripping story. Even though in the end, typically, I don't really look at any relics and think that's exactly what they claim it to be. But I think the tracing of it is interesting. I think the importance of it is interesting. I mean, whole wars have been fought with these things either leading the charge or being the subject that it's been fought over. Some of these relics have been the center of intrigue and bribery and political discourse. I mean, there's so much to it, and I really don't have time to get into all of it, but if you want to do further study, there are a lot of resources out there, so I'd encourage you to look into it just because it's fascinating. I would encourage you not to get too deep and think like faith depends on it or anything, but I do think it's just like a really cool study, like I said, kind of akin to National Treasure or Da Vinci Code kind of stuff. So if you like that stuff, and it's also tied with like real history, So it's not like everything's a lie. It's just that I don't believe that what some of these relics are claimed to be are actually what they are. For example, like the true cross is one of those relics that it's believed that it's the cross that Jesus Christ was crucified on. And they didn't have it initially in like the first few hundred years of Christianity. But then it's believed that they found it, and then when they found it, like some people believed it was, some didn't, and then they broke it up into pieces and shipped splinters of it all over the world and to different churches and stuff. And so there are churches today that boast that they have pieces of the true cross, or some believe they have the crown of thorns that Jesus wore. I believe that's at Notre Dame right now. So there's all these different things that relate to biblical figures or Jesus Christ himself that have been passed down. And I think it was Martin Luther that wrote about some of these things, and he said, kind of sarcastically, not being very literal, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, he said, if you were to collect all the pieces of the cross of Christ, you would have enough wood to build an entire boat, not just one cross that one man could carry up a hill, but a boat that 300 people couldn't lift into the water. Something like that. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's what he said, because once these things got discovered or then rose in prominence and then got divided into little pieces, there were also forgeries made. And so it's really tough to know what's part of the original. Then it's tough to know, is the original part of like the true original? Like, was the cross that they believed to be the cross of Christ actually the cross of Christ hundreds of years later? It's just really tough to know and a lot to sift through. But the Shroud of Turin is one of these that actually has probably the most controversy surrounding it. And I know this might not sound like a good thing on face value, but I actually think the controversy lends it some credibility. Because with a lot of relics, like, I mean, for example, it's believed that one church has the hand of John the Baptist, and it was the hand that he used to baptize Jesus Christ. Now, I have no doubt in my mind that this is not the actual hand of John the Baptist. I have no doubt. I've looked at the history. I've tried to trace it. It's nebulous at best, and I just do not think this is the hand of John the Baptist. But those who do believe that wholeheartedly. But I'm okay to like let them live in that belief, and they're kind of okay to let me live in my belief, and we just kind of move on. The fact that there's controversy surrounding the Shroud of Turin actually means there's some ambiguity to it that's been unanswered. And we're going to get into that in just a minute. But what is it? What is the Shroud of Turin? For those of you that don't know, essentially this is believed to be the burial shroud that covered Jesus Christ after he was crucified. So it's a long length of linen cloth, and it depicts the image of a thin, bearded man. It was first brought out, or like kind of brought to public attention in 1354, which you'd say, well, that's not when Jesus Christ was around, so how can we know that that's the actual one? Well, really, I'm not saying we can, but that's just when it first kind of came to popularity or came to fame. I will say, to its credit, there is some possible evidence that it was around before 1354, or was at least known about, in a thing called the Prayer Codex, which is a kind of a pictorial of the death and resurrection of Jesus, the death and burial of Jesus Christ, and it's got songs on it written in there. But there's images there of Jesus Christ being buried. And what's interesting is, like the Shroud of Turin, which has this image of a man on it, with blood all over it, the man on the Shroud of Turin and the picture in the Prayer Codex of Jesus Christ are in the exact same position. So they're laying back, their arms are crossed over their lower abdomen, their thumbs are like inside their hands, so there's only 4 fingers showing, their thumbs would have been against the body, and then their legs are straight out next to each other. So that's really interesting, and also depicted, the shroud there in the Prayer Codex is a herringbone pattern, just like the Shroud of Turin is. So when they stitched it, they did it in a herringbone pattern, and that's what you see in the Prayer Codex. Now, if this is truly the Shroud of Turin being depicted, well, this Prayer Codex is believed to be from like the late 12th century or early 13th century, which is well before 1354. So it's possible this shroud actually came to prominence in 1354, or kind of came under public opinion or estimation, but actually existed well before this and was well esteemed as being the potential shroud that Jesus Christ was buried in based on this. Again, it's not proof. It's just evidence. It's potential evidence that people will point to. But this shroud has, like I said, blood stains on it, and it depicts a thin bearded man. And it's believed that this would have wrapped Jesus, and it would have been the thing that he was resurrected from. And there's interesting points in favor of it, I would say, but I think some of them go a little bit too far. For example, there's evidence that this man that's depicted on the shroud was crucified. There is his image on this shroud, and there's blood stains on it as well. And so you'd say, okay, well, what would be signs of crucifixion? Well, you'd have blood coming out of the hands and out of the feet. We know that Jesus was scourged, so some of those wounds would be visible as well. We know he had a crown of thorns on his head, so those wounds would be visible. And you do see all of these things. So I would say, like if you look for evidence of crucifixion, it's most likely that the man on this shroud was crucified. The wounds line up with this for sure. It's also most likely that he was scourged. The blood stains line up with this as well. There was a lot of blood found. Crown of thorns, though, this one's a little bit more sketchy in my mind because, like, yes, there is blood around the head of this person, but does that mean necessarily that it was a crown of thorns placed on his head and not just being beaten about the head? I think if you want to see crown of thorns, that's what you're going to see. And if you're a little more skeptical, you're going to refuse to see crown of thorns. So I'll leave that up to like a more ambiguous interpretation. I'll say there is blood around the head of the image of this man on the shroud. That doesn't necessarily mean a crown of thorns. It's not like they found thorns embedded in the shroud necessarily. People will also point to the fact that the nose on this image is a little bit askew. It's a little bit off. It looks like it's been kind of the product of some sort of trauma. And so what they'll say, people who believe that this is actually the shroud that covered Jesus Christ and that bears his image, they'll say that when Jesus Christ was weary and could no longer carry the cross, as we see in the Bible, he actually fell down to the street and hit his head on the pavement, and his nose got injured there. And what's interesting about this is on the shroud, around the nose area, there is dust particles that match what would have been used in building and road construction in Jerusalem in the first century. So that's interesting. However, to be fair, we don't see that in the Bible where Jesus falls down on his face and like breaks his nose or something like that. So, you know, is it interesting? At least that dust particular is like from the first century, or at least like could potentially match with this. That's interesting. But can we say that, well, this extra biblical account of Jesus falling and hitting his nose is proof because we see that on the shroud? I don't want to go that far. We're going beyond the Bible when we do that. There's also interesting evidence in the material itself. The linen that was found is believed to by multiple people, not just those who have some sort of bias for this being the shroud that Jesus had at his death. But there's scientists or even Jewish people who have studied this shroud who have no real bearing or no real dog in the fight on whether or not this belonged to Jesus. They say that the material is kind of unique to Israel. And so that's interesting. I mean, if you were going to have a shroud that belonged to Jesus at his burial, you'd expect that it would have been, from Israel. So that's a check that matches. There's also in the blood testing that's been done on this, there's bilirubin in the blood, which bilirubin is a compound that's released by the liver and the gallbladder whenever a person goes through intense traumatic events or intense suffering. And if you remember Jesus's final time on earth, he was going through intense suffering emotionally, physically. And I mean, even before he's arrested, he's bleeding in the garden. And this is consistent. Whenever there's bilirubin in the blood, it means that there was intense suffering going on for the person whose blood it is. And so Jesus presumably would have had this happen as well as he suffered persecution and torture and execution. Now, also radiocarbon dating. So a few years ago, meaning I think it was like the 80s or so, there was a lot of testing done on this shroud. It was about a 1-inch section taken, which was fought about for years. How much can we take or how much do we need? 1-inch section was taken from the shroud and radiocarbon dated, and it turned out the results said that it was from the Middle Ages. So way too late to belong to Jesus, way past the first century. However, recently, and this is the reason that the shroud is coming back into popularity, recently it's believed that the sample that was taken is actually from a repair that was done on the shroud later. Instead of linen, it's actually cotton threads, and it's a cotton that would not have been used in the first century, but in the Middle Ages. So potentially, this actually, maybe enhances the idea that during the Middle Ages, when this first came out, it was treated with such respect that they even repaired some of the less stable portions of it. So people want to do, on both sides of the aisle, some people want to do more radiocarbon dating on a different section. Some people say, it's not even going to convince anybody anyways. We might as well just leave it intact and not destroy it any further. And there's a lot of debate over this. This is why it's kind of come to the forefront right now, because those tests were found to be less than ideal and less than evidence requires, I guess. And so some people want to do more, some people want to leave it alone. But I would say the falsifiability of those previous carbon dating dates is evidence in favor of it still potentially, at least makes it more ambiguous rather than an all-out absolutely not. And the last piece of evidence that I want to talk about is the image itself. Now, you've seen it. It's on the thumbnail of my video here. If you're watching on the podcast, you can Google it really quick. Just type in Shroud of Turin and a bunch of pictures will come up. The image, what I believe to be this image for a long time, I thought it was made from bloodstains. And this is not the case, apparently. There are bloodstains on the shroud, but this isn't what made the image. It's not like someone painted somebody in blood and then pressed their face against it or something like that. Most of the image is actually believed to be from a really intense burst of light. And even scientists right now will say they don't know how the image was made and is being preserved there. Think of like how a photograph happens, right? There's a burst of light, and then an image is kind of burned into a surface. This same thing is believed to happen with the Shroud of Turin. That's at least one theory. They don't know that for a fact, but it's one way that an image could be burned onto the surface of something like this. And so that's a speculation. It's interesting because they don't truly know how this was made. If it was forged, I mean, it's a hard thing to think of some medieval person or even some first century person doing like intense bursts of light. Like, where did they get the power or the ingenuity to do something like that? And so people aren't sure, how was this image preserved and kind of burned into the very surface of this linen fabric? They don't know. Now, to those that say this is evidence that this is Jesus Christ's burial shroud, they'd say that when he was resurrected, there must have been a burst of light. However, again, this is us going beyond the narrative found in Scripture. We don't see this happening. We don't see that, no one was inside the tomb to see, is there some like transcendent burst of light that allows Jesus to like filter through this fabric? I mean, we just don't see that at all. So I can't say it's proof, but the fact that we don't know how it was made and a forgery is kind of being ruled out more and more as it's studied, there's no paint been found on it or anything, it is at least interesting. So we have to note it and be respectful of that evidence. Now, I want to also go and say there's a lot of evidence against this being the shroud that I actually think takes precedence. And I'm sorry, this is the part where if you're Catholic or Orthodox, you're going to disagree with me. But again, there's all kinds of things you're going to disagree with depending on who's saying it. So again, I'm trying to be respectful here, but there is evidence against it. For one, let's say this shroud was found to be from the 1st century. Well, okay. But there were a lot of crucifixions going on in the 1st century. Even with Jesus himself, there's 2 others on either side of him. So this was a common execution method by Rome. And the problem with denying this and saying, well, no, it wasn't that common, is that this is the argument that skeptics make to say Jesus couldn't have died by crucifixion because the Romans didn't even do that. Historically, we only have a few narratives that speak very openly and explicitly about crucifixion. Now, we still have evidence that it happened, but in a Christian worldview, we kind of believe that this was a general source or method of execution that the Romans had perfected, not something they did just every once in a while. And so I don't want to give up that evidence just to say, well, there were so few of them that it really narrows it down and must be Jesus. Like, if this is a crucified man that was wrapped in this shroud, it could have been any crucified man, even if we bring it back to the 1st century, which again is kind of like debated right now. I already went over the fact that the Bible doesn't say Jesus arose in a burst of light. I think that's worth noting. There's also in John 20, verse 7, I think is the best evidence for this overall, and I'm going to read it real quick to you. John 20, verse 7 is essentially when the apostles are running back to the tomb after they've been told that Jesus is no longer there. Actually, I'm going to start reading in verse 6. It says, "Then Simon Peter came, following him," meaning him, John, "and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself." So here, this word linen cloths is othonion, and it means cloths. It's plural. And it means most often strips of linen, not one sheet. Now, if you believe that the shroud is the shroud that these people are seeing, these apostles are seeing, how do you make sense of it being multiple? If it's one sheet, why does it say multiple cloths? It doesn't seem like Jesus was buried in one shroud, but instead wrapped in linen wrappings with a face cloth over him. Now, interestingly, with the Shroud of Turin, there's another relic that is believed to be the face cloth that was over Jesus as well. And there's pretty good evidence to support that whoever was wrapped in the Shroud of Turin also was wrapped in this face cloth, but that only leaves 2 pieces of linen. And here we obviously see there's multiple pieces of linen and also a face cloth. So you've got plural cloths here, strips of linen, and this doesn't really match with a shroud being used in Jesus' burial. Now, it does say that Joseph of Arimathea went ahead and bought a linen cloth to wrap him in, but most people believe, and the Bible, like the accounts seem to support, that presumably this was used to carry Jesus to the tomb, but then was taken off at the tomb, like I said before. But if this is the case, then how did it get this flash of light in this miracle that some people are claiming? You'll remember that the women went to the tomb to prepare the body, and they wrapped in these linen cloths, or these linen strips, they wrapped spices. And these were to cut down on the smell. And so when people were visiting the tomb, it wouldn't be so overwhelming. It was kind of like an embalming thing as well. And so we have multiple strips here being used in the burial, not just one cloth and a head cloth. So that's worth mentioning. The Bible is silent on if there was a shroud or not. So if we're looking for a shroud and we're saying, well, it has to belong to Jesus, then we're going to look in the Bible and say, where can I find that in Scripture? And it's really tough to do. I like to instead go to the Bible and say, what does the Bible say happened? And the most plain reading you get is that he was wrapped in linen strips, not a shroud. Now, all this said, the Shroud of Turin is still very mysterious. I don't want to downplay that at all, because no one's been able to figure out this burst of light thing. How on earth were they making this? If in fact it's a forgery, or if it's not a forgery, what happened to this person that was wrapped in it? And some people will also say, yeah, so all these evidences are turning out to be true, but it's not Jesus. And I'm saying, well, it's not proven to be Jesus. We can't conclude this necessarily, but it's just as hard to prove that it's not him as it is to prove that it is him. So, and this is just a matter of logic. Again, I think the Bible speaks very clearly on how Jesus was buried, and it doesn't include a shroud, so I'm not inclined to add one to the story. But logically, both people that are trying to prove or disprove this have the burden of proof. They have to prove that it either was Jesus or wasn't Jesus if they want to hold their claim and get others to believe it as well. Anyways, this is all just to say there's so much here. It's very confusing. There's a lot of evidence for and against. And so I want to say, is it possible? Maybe. Is it probable? I don't think so. I don't think the evidence points to that. Here's the real question, though. And this is really what I wanted to drive to the whole time. Does it matter? And the answer is no. I mean, it matters in the sense that this is fascinating and interesting and can be an enriching part of our historical study of things that kind of relate to the Bible and how people think about it. But does it matter if this cloth belonged to Jesus or no? It just doesn't. And so I have a lesson to 3 different types of people. Atheists, if this is you and you're listening to this, the life and death by crucifixion of Jesus Christ is one of the most well attested to historical events in existence. There are no scholars that are atheists that will say that this thing is not true, that Jesus wasn't a real person, that he wasn't killed by crucifixion. And even many of them go as far as to say that the disciples do very clearly claim that they saw him after death and that the tomb was even empty. So you might want to get around this, because if you can kind of hold this off, you don't have to believe the rest of it, and that's fine. Many atheists will conclude, yes, Jesus existed and died by crucifixion, but no, he was not God. You can still hold that if you want, but don't fight this thing, this Shroud of Turin, based on the fact that if it's not true, it means that Jesus didn't exist. That's just not the case. If it did belong to Jesus and somehow we prove it, all this means is that we're proving something we already know to be historically verifiable. So please remember that. Mainstream Christians, especially like evangelicals, we already know that Jesus lived and died and rose again. So of course we do not need this to be true. But sometimes I see a lot of people fighting actively against it as if their faith kind of depends on it. And I think it's with this Protestant-Catholic divide a lot of times. But at the very least, this thing could be evidence that there was brutal crucifixion going on at the time of Jesus, and that this was a common execution method that this other person underwent in the first century. So we should really be concerned with the truth of the Shroud of Turin, not so much fighting to prove that it's wrong, because we don't really gain anything if it's not about Jesus. You're welcome to hold the belief that this doesn't depict Jesus. I also hold that belief, but I refuse to fight against it as if my faith depends on it, because one, that gives it too much credibility, too much stature in my mind that I don't want to grant to it. But two, even if it were, it doesn't change anything for me. So remember that. Keep that in mind. Catholics, please be careful with this. I understand that you're excited at the potential of this being real, but seeing the overestimation that you guys put into relics in general, it just kind of freaks me out. I mean, I'm not going to lie to you. We think about all these things that have happened in Israel's history, and I see you guys mirroring this. I know you say you don't worship, you just venerate, but it looks a lot like what Israel was doing. Think about it. Israel did this with the Ark of the Covenant. This was a place where God would descend and meet with his people, and instead they suddenly believed it to be God himself almost. They carried it into battle as if it was God. And when it left the camp of Israel, they said, God has left our camp. That's not true. So they're beginning to equate things that are physical with things that are spiritual. And the problem with this is because we as humans are so likely to follow after that physical and kind of neglect the spiritual. So we can get really close to worshiping very, very quickly. Israel also did this with a bronze serpent on the pole. They were offering sacrifices to it and it had to be destroyed. So the Ark of the Covenant, as soon as they started kind of worshiping it in the wrong way, God took it away. The bronze serpent, as soon as they began worshiping it, God took it away. Some believe that Israel was even in danger of doing this with the body of Moses. It says that Satan contended with Michael for the body of Moses, and some speculate that this is because Israel might have actually worshipped the body of Moses had it been used for nefarious purposes. This is kind of what I see in reliquary stuff. I mean, you guys are taking hands and fingers and toes of dead people and ascribing some sort of spiritual significance to them. This is a little bit bizarre, and I see it happening potentially in Scripture. And what did God do? He hid the body of Moses away. He did not let Satan prevail over Michael in finding Moses' body. The Jews also did this to the temple. Rejecting Jesus and esteeming the temple was kind of one of the main things they're condemned for. And so God took the temple away. And so this thing that you're looking at as this material object that you appreciate and esteem and want to be true, I understand you're just respecting it or like hoping it's true, hopefully for like historical significance. And you're saying, I'm just venerating it. I'm not worshiping it. But the things you're doing when you're going to it and making it a part of your worship and your religious observance, you're almost hinging your faith on it. You're bowing down to it at times and praying before it or wanting to touch it or kiss these things. And I understand how emotional these things can be, but at the same time, your veneration is looking an awful lot like the worship of Israel towards physical objects. And this was always always condemned by God and resulted in these things being taken away so they were no longer temptations. God was not pleased with their attempt to slide into worship of the physical. Even angels, you can think about it like that. There were often times where people would bow down to angels. And the angels would say, do not bow down to me. I am not. Even though I'm spiritual, even though I've been in the presence of God, I am not to be worshipped. We're only to worship God. So yes, I see your point. You're only venerating, you're not worshiping, but it gets dangerously close, and you have to remember human tendency to worship what we shouldn't. So full disclosure, I think it would be, honestly, so sweet if the Shroud of Turin was legitimate. That would be so awesome. But I'm not convinced. I'm just not convinced of the evidence surrounding it. But the nerd part of me is really into the study. I think it's fascinating. But this should do nothing to affect our faith one way or another. So please don't let it affect yours.